So, evoked culture involves the development of personality traits as triggered by environmental influences. Now, this can get pretty complex, which is another reason why this research is kind of difficult to do, because when you're talking about the environment, well, there are a lot of different aspects to the environment. There is the amount of food that's available, the type of food that's available to you. There is the social environment, the type of economy that a country has. And so all of these things can really shape psychology in fundamental ways. So you hopefully remember when we talked about evocation not that long ago in the this more social-oriented chapter. So what was evocation? Do you remember that principle? It was in regard to social interaction.
Bring something out of someone.
Yeah, so when one person's personality brings something out in another. So we talked in quite a bit of detail about evocation of hostility. So if you have this hostile attributional bias, you're going to evoke more aggressive responses from other people. And so the same type of principle is supposedly at work in studies of evoked culture. So there are two basic elements that are needed to explain this. First, we have a universal underlying mechanism. So this is just a kind of fancy way of saying that people have the potential to react in a certain way or to develop a certain personality characteristic. So if that potential does not exist on a basic biological level, then it's really not possible for culture to evoke something specific in regard to personality. So you need to have the potential, but you also need to have some environmental differences in how this mechanism is activated. So you have to have the potential to do something, and then you have to have some environmental factor that can trigger that potential. So this is really just a different way of thinking about developmental psychology in reference to personality. So depending on the environment in which we develop, different aspects of our personality might be triggered. And you're going to see fairly different environments across cultures. Okay, so thus far we've just been talking about this stuff in abstract ways, so let's start actually talking about some solid research findings so that we can put this all into context. So we'll begin by talking about research on evoked cooperation. So psychologists have found that there are differences from culture to culture in how much people share food.
Could you go back one
Want me to go back? Sure. I know there's a lot on that slide. So these researchers have examined some different factors that might influence how willing people are to share food with others, like friends and family. And they found that one of the biggest important factors is the amount of variance in the food supply. So let's briefly talk about what this whole concept of variance means. You may be somewhat familiar with this if you've taken a statistics course. So what does it mean to say that something has low variance, or very little variance? Anybody know? essentially means that it doesn't change much. So variance is from the same root as like variety. Yeah. So if there's low variance, then there's always the same amount of food. So the food supply doesn't change very much. But what they find is that in cultures that have a high degree of variance in the food supply, and just to clarify, this means that on some days there is just an overwhelming amount of food. There's plenty to go around. And then on other days, there isn't enough food to go around. So this doesn't have to do with the type of food, so having like variety in your diet, as much as the amount of food that's available to the people in that culture. And so they find that in cultures that have a high variance in the food supply, people tend to share more with one another. And so in our own culture, we have a pretty low variance food supply. There's always plenty of food to go around. You don't have that many people who are just starving in America because they can't get food. But then there are other cultures, like the Hadza hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania. And now, they aren't starving, but they experience quite a bit of variability in their food supply. So somebody might go out and take down a large animal, and then there will be a big feast and plenty to go around, and there's a whole lot of sharing. So it isn't like the person just keeps that whole feast for themselves. They share it with others. And then other days, there isn't a successful hunt, and they're just reliant on whatever people could gather, roots and berries and things. And so whether there is a lot of food on a given day or very little food, there tends to be a lot of sharing that occurs in those cultures, right, compared to our own. Right? We're selfish compared to those folks. And there are actually cultural norms that enforce this. So if you have people here in America who don't share a lot of their food, that's not really a big deal. They don't get ostracized, they're just normal people. But if you have somebody in that hunter-gatherer culture and they're really selfish, then people really look down on them and they're disparaged. So, any questions about this evoked cooperation research? All right, so let's change gears now and talk about early experience and how it relates to evoked mating strategies. This is some interesting stuff. So this research was done by Belsky and colleagues. And what they found is that the circumstances that children experience as they're growing up actually have some influence on their mating strategy as adults. So specifically, they find that children who have harsh, rejecting, or inconsistent parents, so this would be like harsh discipline, corporal punishment, or inconsistency. So sometimes the parents are really harsh with the discipline, other times they don't give a damn. So children who experience those circumstances, children who have erratically provided resources, so sometimes their parents will feed them, other times they have to kind of fend for themselves. Or children who experience marital discord, so their parents fight a whole lot around them, or their parents get divorced. All of these factors are shown to lead someone to be more likely to use a short-term mating strategy as an adult. And so we've talked about the distinction between short-term and long-term mating strategies before in here. If you remember the socio-sexual orientation inventory by Simpson and Gangestad, we talked about that, I think, way back when we were in the methods chapter. So people who use a long-term strategy, they just want to find one partner, settle down with that person, spend the rest of their lives in that relationship. People who use a short-term sexual strategy kind of play the field, they like some variety, they don't form strong emotional bonds with others very easily. And so there's some really amazing evidence for this. For example, children from divorced homes go through puberty earlier, and they actually have their first sexual intercourse experience at an earlier age compared to children who came from homes that had not gone through a divorce. So the idea here is that those early experiences, what happened there? So those early experiences might help to explain some of the cultural differences in the value that is placed on chastity and virginity. So this is another area where you see some big differences from one culture to the next and how important they think this is in both men and women, but often the focus is more on women than men. So in our own culture, we don't place a really high amount of value on chastity or maintaining virginity until marriage for the most part. Now there is that double standard where particularly in men, they're almost viewed negatively if they maintain their virginity up into adulthood for any length of time. So you had movies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin, where it was supposedly a very comedic situation that this poor guy, was still a virgin at the age of 40. And so other cultures, though, they think that virginity is really important. And it's so important, in fact, that if a woman in these cultures loses her virginity before marriage, she's pretty much considered worthless. Not so much the case here in America.